Before we get into today's episode, I want to tell you about the Burmese-made handicrafts that are nonprofit sources from vulnerable artisan communities across Myanmar. These lovely crafts bring the life and color of Myanmar to the world. More importantly, their purchase assists the artists and their families, while also going on to support our ongoing humanitarian and media missions. Please take a moment to visit our shop at alokacrafts.com. That's ALOKACRAFTS.com.
Insurgent groups from northeast India, active along the Indo-Myanmar border, engaged in an intense gunfight with Myanmar's rebel factions, the PDF and KNFB, near Meitei in Myanmar, close to Manipur's Kamjong district.
Rising tensions at the Indo-Myanmar border, the Indian government has decided to construct an impenetrable fence.
PDF and KNFB cadres had encircled the camp armed with sophisticated weapons using RPGs and bombs. The Myanmar army reportedly conducted...
Hi, my name is Makepeace Sitlhou. I'm an independent journalist. I've been covering Northeast India since about 2017 now. And of course, since the crisis and the military coup happened in Myanmar, I've been consistently covering what's been happening along India's borders, particularly looking at two states, both Manipur and Mizoram, and looking at really various aspects of it, not just the humanitarian crisis, but also security situation vis-a-vis the armed insurgent groups operating on both sides of the border, and looking at also India's refugee policy, among other, I would say, aspects of this crisis.
Hi, my name is Kimi Colney. I am from Mizoram, and I have been reporting since 2016. I have mostly covered the state of Mizoram, but for a while I also covered the northeast states for around 2 years. Now I work for an independent media house called East Mojo, which is based in Guwahati, Assam. And yes, I have been covering the refugee crisis in our state along the Indo-Myanmar border.
Yes. Thank you both very much. Thank you for joining us and sharing your expertise and your reporting with us. I think it would be good to start and sharing with our audience to give them a bit of basic context and background about Northeast India, the geography, the peoples, the politics, society, anything that you think would be relevant to better understanding what is currently being played out with the Myanmar crisis starting to spill into that area and how they're responding. So, Makepeace, can you give us some background and introduce our audience to the important points you think are necessary to know and to understand about Northeast India?
Yeah, so it's a fairly vast region that's really at the far eastern side of the country in India. It's sort of separated, or rather connected to what we call the Indian mainland by something called the Chicken's Neck. It's a very small, narrow strip of a corridor, that connects it to land masses. I think because of this, tyranny of distance, which is what it's called, a lot of going-ons in the region tend to not reach, reach New Delhi in particular, or, reach most of India. So there's a general lack of awareness also about Northeast India, both among Indians as well as people internationally. It's also, however, geopolitically a very sensitive region. I mean, there are about 8 states in total. For the longest time, it's known as the Seven Sisters because it was like seven states together. But these 8 states, they border like important neighbors both in South Asia and Southeast Asia, like Bangladesh, China, Bhutan, Myanmar. And this is something that I think has been, which is why the region, for that reason, is also looked at as a frontier state, as, something that India has always seen it needs to fortify and protect its borders, but has also often overlooked its own sort of nuanced, politics, its own fault lines, its own sort of, if you can call indigenous concerns and issues. So I would say that's how I would kind of sum up the region.
Yeah, that's a lot to take in. And I think to delve a bit deeper into those fault lines of the diversity, I assume we're talking about ethnic, religious, regional diversity that's each of which probably has its own history in terms of how they got there and how the different groups interrelate. I know this is a subject unto itself that we could spend hours on a separate podcast conversation delving into, but just so we better have an understanding of what's making up that diversity and how it's playing out, so then we can move into the Burmese refugees that are starting to come in. Can you follow up with giving us an overview of how you would describe the diversity in that region to a newcomer who isn't familiar with this region?
Well, I think for most of India, they sort of, club the 7 states, the 8 states again, sorry, as like one sort of a nucleus, right? And we're just sort of known as Northeasterners. And that's also like an awareness level that has come like after like at least 2 decades or something, because for the longest time, we'd be mistaken as like Chinese or other foreign nationals from like, Southeast Asia or like East Asia. So, even to get so far as to be called or to be identified as Northeast Indian feels like some sort of a victory, but it really doesn't capture, what is the real diversity of the region. I mean, there are as many languages, there are so many dialects, to speak of. There are also multiplicity of religions out here. We've got like a mix of people who come from Tibet, from Myanmar, from like, in fact, even from, some older Chinese provinces, Thailand as well. So it's a very, very, diverse, it's a very like mixed up sort of, mixed up ethnicities and, sort of historically speaking as well. There's been so much intermingling between ethnicities and races from all of these regions in Southeast Asia and South Asia, which includes obviously in the Indian mainland as well, because we do have people from, who trace their roots back to Indian mainland as well. So it's really a region that sort of doesn't really have a very well-defined, homogeneous, ethnic kind of identity.
Thank you for that. And Kimi, on this subject of diversity and looking at the history of this diverse region, how it's playing out in the Northeast today and its relation to Delhi, in your reporting, your lived experience, anything that you would like to add to this characterization to help our audience better understand this context?
I think I'd like to add to what Makepeace said, that it's taken a long time for the rest of India to see what Northeast is. And I think sports has played a big factor in that. It's our sportsmen who have helped show that, okay, there is a state here in Mizoram, in Manipur, and that has played a big factor. And even regarding, like from a media point of view, there's a lot of marginalization of the media in the Northeast. And it's still a struggle. Like yesterday, me and Makepeace were discussing about it. And sometimes we feel like, okay, it will never get better. Like, when will Northeast ever be prioritized? But there is development, there is progress, there are more people coming out, there are more people speaking up, and there are more journalists who are coming up, and there is a lot of progress. I just want to take an example of, like, recently in Mizoram, there was a big landslide where around 30 people were killed, and then there was no mention of that by the Prime Minister or anything in his tweets. And he usually mentions any incident, like a fire breaks out and he tells, okay, we're going to pay compensation, we're sorry and everything. But it took him like over 3-4 days to mention about the incident, not just in Mizoram, Manipur. There were floods and like thousands of people were affected. So we've still got a long way to go, but I think there is some progress. Yeah.
That's really interesting. So you're really painting a picture of this isolated frontier territory disconnected from the main centers of power, and what is thought of by Indians as well as those outside of what constitutes India, and something that's kind of off in the periphery, both in a spatial sense as well as in a cultural or psychological sense, it sounds like.
Yes. Yes, that's true. I agree with what you say. Yes. So I lived in I was born in Maharashtra. I went to school in Tamil Nadu, Uttarakhand. So I've been all over India, and I do feel like an Indian first and a Mizo second, but usually that's not how I'm made to feel, because most Indians, even through elementary school, till I started working in a company in Chennai where everyone was very educated, but even there, all through this time, people were not aware of the Northeast states. So I think that really, I don't know, gave me a lot of patriotism, made me want people to see that there's a state here. There are all these 8 diverse states here. And yeah, I think that's something that a lot of people from the Northeast who go to the rest of India, they struggle with that. But yes, as I said before, there is a lot of progress. People are starting to see that we are here. Yeah.
And what I find really interesting is you're providing this context. This is so helpful and valuable for understanding the situation today, because also we have Northeast India, but then as we're looking at Myanmar, it's of course Northwest Myanmar that is also, and when you're looking at the state of Myanmar, this is also a region that is on the periphery, forgotten both psychologically as well as spatially. And so you have this very important relationship between New Delhi and Naypyidaw, between the two countries and the two administrations governing those countries. And yet spatially and physically, that relationship is played out in a region that's somewhat forgotten and frontier to both of those power centers. So how do you see this playing out in terms of the political power bases and how they talk, but then simultaneously on another level, you have the physical borders, which are far away from those respective power bases?
Well, this is a bit of a running joke. We realize this also, coming here, as well as we're very acutely aware of this, right? That, we have that sort of kinship, not just ethnically with, let's say the Chin state or parts of Sagaing region. We also realize that we're the third world part of the third world, so it really doesn't help us as much to be represented, to be heard by the power centers. And, I think it also explains because, we've spent a couple of days in Mae Sot, where obviously we've met a lot of migrants, a lot of people who are refugees, escaping the crisis in Myanmar. But often the questions around Chin state or anything along India's, it's not about India's borders with Myanmar, but what's happening on that side of Myanmar, the western side, is fairly unknown to people. A lot of the, especially let's say the members of the NUG, CRPH, or for that matter, even the journalists who are currently living in exile here because they come from places like Yangon or maybe from the current state. So, it's something that it's sort of almost like a repeat of, speaking to a slightly, a very, very uninitiated audience back at home, as well as, also seeing that sort of blank stares over here. So, I think it's this constant feeling of marginalization that we feel wherever we go.
So I think that's a good segue to the question we've talked about before this interview of just contrasting the border situation for the Myanmar refugees and migrants in Thailand with Mae Sot and with India and the Northeast corridor that we're talking about. And as you've spent so much time looking at the Burmese situation there, which we'll get into later, but before we do, you've just spent the last week exploring and understanding the dynamics here in Thailand. And so how would you contrast the similarities and differences between what the Burmese are facing here and what you've seen them facing in your home state?
Yeah, so I just first I want to add to what she said, because Mizoram is hosting a lot of refugees, around 40,000 refugees right now, and so I had this understanding. I mean, it was a very ignorant understanding, but that when I came to Mae Sot and when I met the people of Myanmar here, the refugees here, there would be a kinship. But that was not actually the case, because they were not really aware of what's happening on that side of the border, and they were not so aware of the Chin community and there in Mizoram or in Manipur. So that was a new learning for me. So yeah, even while speaking to the refugees here in Mae Sot, I was telling them I wish the refugees in Mizoram could come here, because here they have support from the government. I know there are a lot of restrictions. They live in a lot of fear. They don't have it. I don't mean that they have it good either, but they have it better than the refugees in Mizoram, because in Mizoram, our state is already, as we said, we are the third world in a third world. Our state does not have any funds to sustain itself. We depend on the central government for over 90% of our funding. And for us to be able to accompany thousands and thousands of refugees, it's a crisis. I was just talking to the DC of Long Klai district, which is hosting over 7,000 refugees right now, and I was asking him how is the situation, and he said, this is already too big a number. We cannot take any more than this. So it's some villages are supporting a refugee population that's bigger than the village population. So it's really a humanitarian crisis. People literally run out of food. There's little aid from INGOs, and much lesser than it is in Thailand. So I mean, we can't compare two tragedies. I can't say this. It's not fair to do that, but I think it's really a crisis back in Mizoram.
And then looking at the refugee situation in Northeast India, we talked before about the difference between how the power centers are talking to each other, the respective power centers, and the actual physical places of those peoples that are coming in contact. And so how would you contrast how New Delhi has been responding to the developing crisis in Myanmar and their close ties with the military, with how the regional actors, the local actors, the people and the local governance, how in India, in Northeast India, Mizoram and Manipur, how they're responding to the Burmese that are fleeing physically to their place?
Yes. So yes, India is not a signatory of the refugee convention, and I think she would have a lot to say about Manipur, so she will add to that. But in regard to Mizoram, yes, even from the beginning of the coup, they were asked to send back the refugees from Myanmar, but our chief ministers, despite all their weaknesses in this particular point, or they have been very strong. They have stood very strong against the central government. They said, we're not sending anyone back. We have a new chief minister who was recently elected. He has also stated again that we welcome all the refugees and we will not send anyone back. So, and I think even the central government is aware that they cannot force them. There's nothing they can do to force them, because we do share a kind of brotherhood. We have ethnic ties with them. If you look at us, if you look at our language, everything is quite similar. So it's like how they say you are separating people of the same family, and I think that's not possible, and that's not something that Narendra Modi can force even a small state chief minister to do, because it would create havoc if they try to forcefully do that. But they've tried to close the border, but I think even that has gotten a lot of opposition. And from what our chief minister said, he said he's hopeful that they will not be sealing the border, but let's see. The Mizoram side of the border, I mean, closing the scrapping the free movement regime. I think you might be aware of the free movement regime, like people from India and Myanmar in a Mizoram border can cross on both sides up to 16 kilometers. So they're trying to scrap the free movement regime, but even that has seen a lot of opposition. People have gotten together in protest opposing that. But let's see how it plays out. Yeah.
So then, before moving to Manipur, just a follow-up question about Mizoram. It's very laudable. You mentioned the chief minister and people because of this sense of shared brotherhood and sisterhood connection with ethnic people across the border, helping them in their time of need and resisting the New Delhi's demand that they return them. However, this is a conflict that's been stretching 3.5 years. It's only getting worse. It's particularly getting worse in Chin State, and the refugees are only fleeing in greater numbers from the extreme harm and violence that's happening in Myanmar. You yourself referenced how there's now camps that are eclipsing the size of towns and villages in that region. You've mentioned there's not resources to be able to support them. So how is this situation continuing to play out, even with all the goodwill in the world to want to support these communities coming? If the resources aren't there, what's that looking like?
Yeah, it's hard to say, but from my opinion, I don't see a very hopeful future, because see, from the refugees, if 100 are good and if 10 are bad, the deeds of the 10 they come out in the community. I mean, they play a big role in the community. Everyone hears about it. Like, especially now we have a lot of drug smuggling going on, and even the government authorities have said that this has increased after the influx of refugees. So, especially among the youth, there's a growing apprehension towards the refugee population. Like, regarding scrapping of the free movement regime, I did a story on how the youth are actually in favor of scrapping the free movement regime, because a poll was done on the college students in Mizoram, the political science students, and they were actually in favor of it. They said, we are okay with continuing to visit each other and crossing the border, but doing it legally, because there is like such a big rise of smuggling of drugs, and which is a very sad situation, actually. So it's hard to say. Yeah, it's hard to see a bright future.
I see. Let's turn to Manipur. How would you contrast how things have been playing out in Manipur to how they've been developing in Mizoram?
I would say like Manipur is like diametrically opposite to how at least both the government and certain section of the locals in Manipur have been responding to the humanitarian crisis, to the refugee inflow, basically. At the beginning of the crisis, there were also these set of like extremely like reprehensible orders that were passed by the central ministry, pretty much asking them to like push back in those words, migrants who come in and, because, I mean, they're also like designated as illegal migrants, so they're like, they've been asked to like push back, and like the way that Mizoram government has responded is just basically like, we'll do our thing and just leave us be. They've not like agreed to or adhered to any of these sort of orders from the central ministry. But it's also an important, I think, fact to note here that there's a regional party in power in Mizoram, which is not the case in Manipur. Manipur does have the BJP, or the Bharatiya Janata Party, government in a coalition, with other regional parties, but they are the majority party, which is why there's that kind of, willingness to, basically give in to these orders. But I think besides the sort of, party command and that kind of, structure, to, sort of follow instructions, there's also an implicit sort of, let's say, interest or stake, of the majority community in Manipur. Just to give a very quick sort of background or context on Manipur, it's basically it's often described as a bowl-shaped sort of state where the bottom of the bowl is the valley, which is occupied by what the ethnic Meitei community. The Meitei communities are mostly composed of Hindus, and there's a small percentage of them who follow an indigenous faith, as well as those who are Muslims as well, and Christians. But the latter three are very small minority. However, at the edge of the bowl the state is surrounded by hills, and that makes up like the larger proportion. At least like 70% of that land is hills, which is occupied by, very broadly speaking, two tribes. That's the Nagas and the Kuki-Zos. So since the crisis actually occurred, because the borders, of Chin State and Sagaing basically, share. These states in Myanmar share borders with, with the Kuki Hill areas as well as the Naga areas. They've obviously been receiving refugees in both these parts. I think the difference is that they've been doing it sort of in the beginning of the crisis. They were doing it really sort of silently. They were doing it really discreetly, knowing well that it's a BJP government in power in the state, as well as the fact that the majority community, that is the Meiteis, are not really in favor of these refugees being brought in. I mean, by and large. But also, I think it's important to distinguish here that in the beginning of the refugee crisis, I'm talking about 2021, it wasn't like the Meiteis were necessarily very, very abjectly opposed to letting refugees in. There was just little recognition of, of the refugees coming in. And it's also true that they were not like, the inflow of refugees was much lesser compared to what was coming. I mean, the kind of numbers that Mizoram were taking in. So, so there wasn't much recognition of that from the Meitei community. There were, in fact, quite a few civil society actors who also felt that to give them some sort of like a temporary stay and everything, and, to not necessarily push them back, because they did recognize this as a humanitarian crisis and not just as an ethnic sort of a kinship thing, right? Arrangement or something like that. But for at least like 2 years, a good 2 years, the state government in Manipur sort of, either pushed them back, which has been seen like in several videos and stuff like that. It's also been reported, or detained them in detention centers as well as a central jail. But besides that, a lot of refugees, however, still managed to surgically come in. And, and I think instead of sort of like, even despite being perhaps aware of it officially, it was like some sort of a sinister design, which was to be seen only later in 2023, where, they wouldn't really like acknowledge, or they wouldn't really record or, take the details down of all the refugees who were coming in, to kind of just know where they are located, and things like that, and just how many you've got them in the state. What later happened was this kind of politics around refugees coming in. And because refugees, a lot of the refugees had like sort of similar, they came from the same ethnic stock as many of the Kuki-Zos, the government basically decided to, play politics over it and say that, en masse, this whole community, the ethnic community, are like illegal immigrants. So they kind of use the refugee bogey to kind of demonize an entire community. It's again an important thing to note here that they left out the Nagas, and I think that's obviously something that you'll need a separate podcast episode for. But I'll just talk about the Kuki-Zos here. That there's a lot to sort of speak in terms of like why they did this for just the Kuki-Zos, But I think that's where what happened was that back then, like sometime in early 2023, they sort of started this whole village survey sort of an exercise where they got a couple of like the state legislative members and a couple of bureaucrats in Manipur to kind of, do the survey of certain refugee camps to get a number of just how many refugees were there. And if I'm not, they didn't do it for all the districts. They did it for I think about four districts in the hill areas. And the outcome of that, again, the methodology of how they went about it, none of that is known. All of this is very opaque. So, I'd still take these numbers with a little bit of a pinch of salt. But what came out of that survey, that preliminary survey, if you will, was that there were at least about 3,000 to 5,000 refugees who were, that we had in the state. Which is, when you think about it, it's really nothing, especially when you compare to 50,000. At some point in Mizoram, because I had been reporting there since 2021, they were almost touching like a lakh or something like that, like whatever, 100,000, something like that, in the worst of times, right? But just with a mere 5,000 figure, the chief minister, basically the head of the state in Manipur, managed to drum up so much hysteria that we've just really, conducted this village survey in like 4 districts and we found like 5,000. You can only imagine how many more would be fine if you had to do a very thorough survey everywhere, So this became a very convenient ploy to kind of, drum up this hysteria about illegal immigrants coming across the borders. And of course, the usual and very predictable anxiety of how they would, take our jobs, take our land, just take everything basically. So, that's kind of that's also that became in some way it's sort of course, with many other factors coming into play, segued into what has been, an ethnic conflict, a civil war really between two communities, since more than a year in Manipur, primarily between the Meitei community as well as the Kuki-Zo tribes living in the hills. And it has led to this absolute, separate administration of sorts, at least informally or even to some extent in paper, where, everyone, not just the people, not just the residents who have been completely, shifted from one area to another according to their, the majority dominance of that particular area, but even officials, even police officials and bureaucrats have been given postings based on, their ethnicity and that they should be posted in areas where, their respective ethnicity is the majority. So in a sense, it has divided the state, and we've got these war zone buffer zones separating the hills and the valley. And, as we speak, there are still conflicts and, clashes going on and still a lot of violence and still more deaths.
This is incredible. So you're talking about a civil war that's emerging between, just to be clear, the Meitei community and the Kuki-Zo, but the Kuki-Zo that are Indians.
Yeah.
That we're not talking strictly about the refugees coming in, but we're talking about those holding Indian passports that are residing there physically.
Right, absolutely. I mean, what is of course painted by a lot of the radical sections of the Meitei community, and unfortunately that includes the CM as well, the chief minister himself, who's probably the most radical head, of them all, is that everyone is all the Kuki-Zo communities en masse painted as not as refugees necessarily. Again, refugee would be saying that they're refugees would be acknowledging their plight, right? So that would be too kind of word to kind of, use them, or too kind of label to slap on them, They instead use things like illegal immigrants. And that's what really then sort of drives that sort of very xenophobic kind of a hysteria, rouses those kind of sentiments, right? But yeah, to be clear though, the fight really, in any of these conflict, in any of the conflict or any of the clashes that have happened, it's the refugees are hardly involved. I mean, they're in a pretty hand to mouth state. I mean, they couldn't possibly get on the front line and start be able to be in a position to fight in any way. So it's really the people who are. I mean, at least I can speak as someone from the Kuki-Zo community, and from what I've seen and reported, I mean, they've mostly been on the defense, where certain radical groups, as well as the what we know as valley-based insurgent groups who had been taking shelter in Myanmar for the longest time, have now kind of, returned home in Manipur, and they're basically, doing these incursions in the hills, under of course, the guise of basically maintaining the integrity of the state and, not allowing it to get sort of split up according to them, by the illegal immigrants or the forces, even for that matter, certain forces from the People's Defense Forces in Myanmar. So there's just a lot of disinformation going around. But I mean, the truth of the matter, which of course, even the government even knows, that it really is a war that's driven by, by purposeful disinformation, and a lot of brainwashing, a lot of fake news, again, especially pushed by the media and the valley, which between two communities who otherwise were getting along all right. It's something that there's so much like to unpack there, but there's a lot to unpack there. But we've also like seen for the longest time, and there's been this sort of like there's been this news or this kind of rumor that's been beaten around for the longest time that the People's Defense Forces are aiding some of the insurgent groups who are from the Kuki-Zo community in fighting the Meitei forces, or for that matter, the army or the Manipur police, right? Again, to sort of, again, important to mention here that the Manipur police, which is again by and large made up of Meiteis, have been fighting on the side of the Meitei forces and not necessarily been a neutral force as they're required to be. But there's been a recent statement that has been brought out by the National Investigative Agency, which is one of India's premier investigative agencies, which has again quite out of the blue, just shortly after the election results, where effectively the people have voted for the Indian National Congress, the India Bloc, the opposition party, and not the BJP. Right, saying that the PDF in Burma is kind of aiding the Kuki-Zo groups in basically sort of creating this creating as well as further fueling the Manipur crisis. But before that, about a month or two before that, the same investigative agency had brought out a very detailed charge sheet in which they had alleged that certain Naga insurgent groups, and the Meitei insurgent groups had basically, had played a very important role in kind of aligning with each other and attacking Kuki-Zo community, areas in Manipur. So again, in a way, they've kind of got everyone involved, and I mean, there's some truth to it, but I guess the more explosive part of this whole recent statement is an official sort of admission, or maybe the first time that an Indian agency is, actually saying or acknowledging the role of PDF, which still remains to be, let's say, confirmed or substantiated, because while this is just a statement, there's been no evidence to back it up.
So can we connect what's going on locally, physically, going back to these power centers and how their relationship and their aims may or may not play into this? Because as you're talking, I'm wondering, is from these communities that are, or these individuals in those communities that are pushing this kind of conspiracy theory or exploiting maybe different fractures that have existed and using them for this purpose to capitalize on them and make and see the kind of gains that they're looking for, is are they simply looking at, well, we don't really care what's going on that side of the border, we just want you out, and we want to take advantage of the situation to for our own ends? Or do you see any kind of wider aim there of aligning with the military, being the Burmese military, being against the democracy movement, or something a bit more sinister, a bit more top level that is affecting or playing out these kind of regional and physical violence that's taking shape?
I think at this point, it still would be a bit of an overreach for me to kind of, necessarily put together an analysis of like the larger sinister design, because I mean, it's something that I would say most of us from Manipur have still been sort of scratching our heads around. What's the, I mean, well, we understand how the state government is playing it out. I mean, they're obviously playing the ethnic majoritarian card here, but what's the BJP party in the center, which is essentially like a cowbelt party, what we call it, a very Hindu majoritarian party. What is their skin in this game here, right? I mean, I think everyone knows this very well. It's that, Indian government has maintain very, sort of good diplomatic relations with the military junta. And that's been consistently so, I mean, through this whole period, I mean, even before the coup as well. And they have in the past sort of, had this sort of an understanding where the Indian government, would kind of get this sort of like a consent, or with the consent of the military junta, they would, kind of flush out like, insurgents, like a lot of Indian insurgents, who are again separatists, from Manipur or for that matter from Nagaland and all of that, to flush them out of shelter camps or base camps that they have in Myanmar. But sorry, what's happened since the coup, what's happened since the coup is that we've seen two things. We've seen two major developments. We've seen the involvement of the Manipuri or the Meitei insurgent groups, who are fighting along with the junta and who are fighting the People's Defense Forces. I mean, it's something that has come out, and I've also spoken to people who are in CNA and, CNF and these kind of forces as well, the Chin State forces basically, who've talked about like their clear role in fighting on the side of the junta. I mean, the clear role of the Meitei insurgent groups. And, but also with the kind of with the kind of gains that PDF is getting, particularly in the ethnic areas, I believe, this has also meant that the bases, the safe havens of the Meitei insurgent groups have been essentially, disrupted, and they've had to basically move back into India. They've had to move back into India. They've had to kind of come back to India and things like that. And just Manipur being in this crisis, kind of a crisis mode, and again that sort of separation happening of the ethnic communities between the hills and valley seems very rather convenient. I mean, I can only kind of paint what the picture is without necessarily giving you the analysis. But it seems convenient, a time, when of course things were not going too great for them in Myanmar. At the same time, the second thing is also the involvement of what is called KNAB, or Kuki National Army Burma, which has been helping the PDF forces. They've been helping PDF forces even in border townships like Tamu in Sagaing region, which borders More in Manipur. So KNB has had that sort of involvement, very clear involvement, and actually very public support as well for the PDF. And if I'm not mistaken, they're very much counted as PDF and not just they're not with PDF, but they're actually part of the PDF in that sense. So they are being the Burmese division of the Kuki National Army. They are part of the democratic movement. They are part of the resistance, So with them gaining ground, there's been this kind of there is a certain there's always a bit of a, let's say, I would not say discord, but there's always a little bit of distance, I would say, in what India sort of frames as sort of, their national security policy or kind of approach, and also what it sort of, frames as or the way it approaches foreign relations or geopolitical relations, right? And also what's happening on the ground vis-a-vis what its intelligence agencies tend to how they tend to operate and how they tend to kind of, let's say, strike their dealings, right, with many of these groups. And this is just from my general understanding through my career of reporting on, insurgent groups and armed groups and, sort of counterinsurgency in India. So, what I find generally to be is, very often that a lot of intelligence agencies usually work with the goal of keeping national security in mind, what is good for India's national security, which obviously with the Manipur insurgents kind of coming back, that would be seen as a good thing. I mean, there was in fact even a ceasefire agreement that was signed with one particular Manipuri insurgent group. And this was a group that, it was certainly the pro-talks faction of the group. But it certainly was a group that would have never in a million years thought of, having political talks with the Indian government, because they were so adamant about being, about basically their own autonomy and being separated from India, right? So but at the same time, I find that there is a sort of dissonance, or there's certainly this kind of a distance where how India would conduct itself diplomatically and geopolitically with countries doesn't quite reflect what happens on the ground vis-a-vis intelligence agencies, because intelligence agencies, at least for the longest time, did work keeping national security in mind. But for a lot of, for however what's going on, at least in New Delhi, or vis-a-vis the MEA, the Ministry of External Affairs, I mean, they would just have something else completely in mind, you know. So it's a little difficult to kind of be able to draw up that sinister design. It's a little early, I would still say. I mean, there's certainly a lot happening afoot, but I would say it's a bit premature to be able to draw very, like, you know, easy conclusions, because also to not fall into the same easy trap that many other people tend to, you know, whatever, get into. So, yeah.
I just want to come back to the reference that you made a little bit ago about the Meitei insurgents that are fighting the PDF in Myanmar. If you can describe the history of that, how long they've been there, and what their aims are for crossing the border into another country to wage conflict there. That seems at odds with the kind of fractured reality that you described in Northeast India and the gains they're trying to make in country, why they're then going out of country to go beyond their communities.
Well, I think they went out of the country. I mean, they crossed the border. And it's been like a, you know, pattern for a lot of northeast-based insurgent groups for the longest time to take shelter in places like Myanmar, Bangladesh. There was a time when they were, you know, pretty well fortified in Bhutan until they were flushed out of Bhutan as well. I mean, that's something that's part of history that everyone mostly knows about, right? So it's uncommon and, you know, hardly unimaginative to even think they would obviously take shelter across the border. But as I was still telling you also about, like, the kind of, you know, sort of negotiations or the understanding between the Indian government and the military junta that, you know, in terms of, like, dealing with these insurgent groups. So even this, despite this, like, you know, this very hoity-toity relations, good relations, and this loud, like, proclamations between, especially coming from the Indian government, that, you know, we've got a good relationship going on with military junta, and, you know, they're giving us the access and they're letting us destroy, like, you know, the camps of enemy bases and things like that on their side of the border. But in fact, I mean, military junta were playing it pretty safe. Like, they were in some sense like double crossing India. Like, many camps still remain. And certainly, I mean, I think the you know, the kind of civil war between the PDF and the junta sort of really exposed the fact that there were still several, there were just newer base camps that were set up basically for, you know, for the Meitei insurgent group. So they were not really dealt with as India had so, you know, proudly or boastfully proclaimed. You know, they've just been been sort of, you know, they just struck a different kind of arrangement with them. So when the crisis happened and when the resistance obviously, like, you know, sort of came to their doors, or when the resistance really gave a real sort of, you know, challenge to the military junta, that's when it was time for them to kind of, you know, ask for their pound of flesh. So that's how essentially the Meitei insurgent groups, in exchange for a safe base, a safe haven in Myanmar, fought the war for, you know, on their behalf.
So you're describing a kind of alignment of either of purpose, if not actually strategically, but at least an alignment of purpose between the Meitei insurgents that are doing the junta's bidding for them and fighting the common enemy, and the junta obviously being pleased that they have some measure of support. How does New Delhi look at look at this relationship going on in a physical place?
I mean, honestly, from, you know, like, from the outside, I mean, when I say from the outside, I really mean from the media trenches. And really, I mean, since the last 10 years, media trenches are really far away from where the government sits, right? We don't have that sort of access anymore. And people are not as amenable to talk as they would before. But even then, like, you know, it seems quite ridiculous. It makes India look extremely, you know, naive, to say the least, because, and even despite these, you know, sort of revelations kind of, you know, coming to the fore, and obviously, like, you know, with, all of them coming in print or, you know, being revealed in the media, they sort of still have their horse blinders on. They kind of, like, that's sort of the approach that India takes with a lot of, like, I would say, like, you know, foreign developments and foreign relations, you know. And I think in some sense, again, when it comes to India's northeast and Myanmar, they can kind of almost get away with it, because it's not, again, a very watched corridor, unlike Pakistan, right? Like, obviously something along Pakistan, Kashmir would just, like, you know, is so heavily scrutinized, and, you know, for very understandable reasons, of course. But anything along the eastern borders is just, like, you know, it again flies in the faces of most people because of ignorance largely, and they don't know these intricate, or I mean, some of these details are not even really that intricate. They're there, but people aren't really aware of it. They don't know the dynamics, or they don't know how, in terms of even counterinsurgency or national security, they're being dealt with. So they sort of get away with it. They're not really asked those kind of hard questions by most of even the journalists. I mean, for all kinds of reasons, So, but however, I mean, of course, for those who know, for those who follow, it doesn't make India look like they really have I mean, and I'm not just talking about after the coup, right? With, of course, India coming up, I think, quite a bit on the radar by international agencies, or either think tanks or research groups, or for that matter, even the medias. What exactly is India doing, continuing to do business with the junta, and of course, like, flying down or flying them down, sort of having these, like, very grand photo ops and things like that. But even before the coup, like, India's always seemed like this very weak regional player, and I mean, in the sense that there's obviously they aspire, or somewhere, it's not something that they just even aspire. I think for them, in their heads, they're already the big player, but they don't have the track record to show for it.
I do want to ask another question about the refugees, getting back to them and their plight. And as you've both illustrated here, the larger numbers in Mizoram, but the harsher conditions in Manipur. And I want to give our listeners a better sense of how it looks and feels there. You've referenced the camps, where they're living, where they're making temporary homes as well, and the shelters, as well as detention centers. I assume those are more on the Manipur side, but I don't know if they're also in Mizoram. But I wonder if, in terms of if you visited some of these camps, differences among the camps as well as the detention centers, I wonder if you can give us an impression of what life is like there. And if you're able to, because you just came back from Mesat, contrasting it with, you referenced before about how the state is supporting or not supporting these refugees. But in terms of the actual life, if you can give some color into how you're seeing life play out and the hardships that people have day to day and living in these places, as well as detention centers.
Okay, so the refugee camps that I visited in 2022, I think we went to a refugee camp near Inlunglei district, and I was there. We were there to shoot a documentary. And then we interacted with some of them. There were around 600 to 700 people there, and the people who were supporting them, the village, the village population was half of that. They were around 300.
Wow.
And they told when we were talking and like trying to set up interviews, and they said that we were informed that we even went through their kitchens and all, and then their sleeping area, like, just to describe, they were in a place that was formerly used by the army. It was uninhabited, like it was left desolate, and the government kept them there. So it was this cold, hard floors. People of all ages, 60, 70, 80, and a lot of children, a lot of nursing mothers, they just put like a sheet of cloth and they had to sleep there. And then people were still coming in every day, but they were even sleeping on the like entryways. There was no more space there. And then the people who are looking after them, they informed me that they only had food left and enough food left for maybe the next 2-3 days. They literally running out of food, and the people of the village, there was nothing more that they could do. And our state government is very, very poor, and so even Makepeace had supported me. We reached out to people through Instagram, and we raised funds for them for maybe for another month. So that's like just giving an example of the kind of crisis that it is there. It's very difficult, but some INGOs, a few are there, like through people in Mizoram, they're trying to extend support, but it's really not enough. And the situation is quite bad there. We even went to Far Kon, which is on the far end of the border, and even there, we went inside the homes of the people. They were staying in makeshift huts, and some of them were staying in like their relatives' empty huts. when we interviewed the people, like some of them said they had 100 rupees. Like 100 rupees, you can get salt and water. Maybe there's nothing much you can get. They were just solely depending on the YMA, which is like an apex NGO for Mizoram. Even the YMA, they have their good and bad sides, but regarding the refugee crisis, they've been doing a lot. So they are the ones who usually mobilize funds, collect funds for the refugees, and distribute food and clothes. And so that's what the situation is like there. To go into details, I think it would take too long, but so just taking like one or two examples. And in Mae Sot, we did not visit the refugee center, the refugee camp actually. So it's hard to understand like how to compare even. But from the exiled people living in Mae Sot, I think they also have their struggles. But yeah, they are able to work. They are able to open restaurants, which is not possible in Mizoram. Mizoram, the people, even though they've welcomed them, they've put a strict imposition that they cannot open place of business, they cannot have any land, or they cannot have any government identification cards, I think, which is the same here. But so it's much harder for them to find a living. It's much harder for them to find a living. And yeah, that's the situation there. Thank you.
Yeah, I feel like comparing what's going on in Mizoram primarily, I mean, Manipur doesn't really have these designated camps as, you know, what the kind that Mizoram has, especially because, at least from what I've seen and what I know, you know, people are being housed in, you know, whatever structures that exist basically, or in people's homes, you know, inside people's homes. So this, I mean, that is also, of course, happening in Mizoram as well. But because of this lack of, like, you know, infrastructural or government support in Manipur, so that even that doesn't really exist. So, you know, it's just really like, it's just really family members. It's just like family members, you know, swelling up in houses and in households, right? So that's really the situation in Manipur, which is, I guess it's in many ways much worse, as well as, you know, even more awkward in some sense, right? But I think comparing like Mae Sot and like Mizoram as a whole, in a sense, is really like apples and oranges, actually, in some ways. And also, of course, there's a huge divide in terms of like development and, you know, kind of like, so whatever, amenities basically being available. And this, I think this is where that distinction is important to make as well, that, you know, that the Tak province, which is where Mae Sot comes under, is, you know, is just much more affluent, you know, a place compared to like Mizoram as a whole. Like, I think they were, you know, we were going around and there were parts that Kimi was looking at, I mean, certain malls and stuff, and they're like, they've got bigger malls than what we've got in the capital, right? And that's the reality. That's really the reality of it. I mean, there are bigger malls really than what we've got probably in the entire Northeast, not just in Aizawl actually. But I mean, malls aside, though, really, it's why I think it's all apples and oranges is also because it's a difference of the way that the power center in Thailand has developed Mae Sot as a place. I mean, we've been given quite a bit of background as well on it in terms of how it used to be a ghost town, but, you know, the government also saw that sort of like, you know, potential in it with, you know, many migrants basically coming in across the border. I mean, besides just the formal entry points being designated, there's always, these borders are porous. You can never keep people out, you know, from coming in and out of borders or crossing borders, right? And they acknowledged that as a reality. And I think it's very exceptional in that regard. And having been in borders, not just in the Northeast, but also in the US-Mexico side, it's instead of like putting up walls or like ridiculous shipping containers or trying to like end the FMR, the free movement regime, or, you know, taking any of these oppressive sort of steps, they saw the business potential in it. And they were like, hey, we can have like, you know, this can be a whole, you know, city and a center unto itself. You know, let's throw up some malls here. Let's throw up like, you know, whatever developments out here. You know, let's bring up some industries and facilitate like some sort of a, you know, working condition, or I don't know, temporary work permits for the migrants and the refugees and things like that. You know, let's see how this actually feeds and helps our economy as opposed to what has been done in India, where it's just like hysteria and, a place like Mizoram, any which way doesn't get, it doesn't get much. I mean, it's also like, I mean, another thing that I think was important to bring in is that, Mizoram is not just one of the poorest places. It's situated really in the highlands. It's one of the, highest places, one of the highest hill stations in India. It doesn't produce anything.
Yeah.
It imports everything from outside. So cost of living in Mizoram has always been very high, even for the locals themselves, right? So it's hardly sufficient for the locals, and people struggle. They're on several other human development indexes. Actually, Mizoram's pretty good actually, and better than many parts of India. But that's also just largely because of the kind of culture that they have there. I think Kimi should talk a little bit about that. With NGOs like the YMA, how they sort of have this, in some sense, a very socialist setup where everyone gets something, there's a certain amount that's insured to everyone. That's how they sort of divide their resources, because there are just so little. I mean, contrast that to Mesot, which is really an up and coming town, right? You look at that town and you think it's somewhere in the middle of somewhere. It's just like almost, Chiang Mai sort of, kind of a potential. Somewhere probably very inland or, closer to the power center, but that's not the case. And I think that's the contrast here that was very striking for me.
That's very helpful. Thank you very much. And I also, as you're contrasting this, the thing that's coming to my mind is one, that Mesot has a history at least from the '88 movement in Myanmar, when I don't know if the town predates that, but at least through '88, when a lot of the democracy activists were fleeing, Mesot was being developed. So that's a several year history developing that town and developing the Burmese community there and their relationship to Thailand, that this is that we don't see in Northeast India. And I also, as we think about what's going on in Manipur and Mizoram, it also comes to mind that you're all describing what's happening once those refugees get in there and the life they face. We also have to add how difficult it is for them to even reach the border, that the roads are not great, that many of them are coming on foot, and unimaginable difficulties of the age and physical condition of the people having to reach just the border area, let alone the violence that they're having to avoid. They're fleeing and then having to avoid as they reach that border. So I also just want to emphasize and highlight the situation that the refugees are facing in Manipur and Mizoram, that their trouble started long before this, as with anyone who's had to flee their home from violence. So these are really powerful reflections and information that you've been able to provide us about the context in your home state and how that's changing, how the physical nature of these communities in your home states are changing, and perhaps in India as a whole is being affected by the violence that's going on in Burma, as well as learning about being able to contrast. I think many listeners in their mind will have some either experience or connotation, understanding of Mesot, understanding the role it's played. People familiar with Myanmar have Mesot as a name that comes up, but I think Mizoram and Manipur not so much. And so these are just names that we're hearing in this, as you've described, this frontier region. So being able, the fact that you have recently been to these places in Thailand and you're able to bring that contrast and eventually parse it out as apples and oranges, I think this is very relevant to our listeners trying to gain a better understanding.
I just think that there needs to be a gap, that has to be bridged both on the Indian and Myanmar side as well. I mean, let's also not forget that Myanmar does have a parallel government. Of course, I know it's still waiting to be formally recognized and given that sort of due recognition and things like that. But even with that in place, even with the kind of structure that they have in place, with the parliament, with the national unity government, and let me underline the fact that it's a national unity government. I think it's important for them to also be as aware of what's going on in India's on borders, which are, on the Indian side, on the Western side, as it is important for Indian government or for Indians to know what's going on in their eastern borders.
Yeah, I think I want to add to that, because that's what we've been discussing a lot. And it's really hard to digest the fact that the NUG or the CRP here has very little knowledge of what is going on that side of the border or on our side of the border. And I think to be able to form a national unity government, this is something that they really have to work on.
For whatever reason, even as the conflict in Myanmar continues to worsen, it somehow continues to be shut out of the Western media news cycle. And even when the foreign media does report on the conflict, it's often presented as a reductionist, simplistic caricature that inhibits a more thorough understanding of the situation. In contrast, our podcast platform endeavors to portray a much more authentic, detailed, and dynamic reality of the country and its people, one that nurtures deeper understanding and nuanced appreciation. Not only do we ensure that a broad cross-section of ideas and perspectives from Burmese guests regularly appear on our platform, but we also try to bring in foreign experts, scholars, and allies who can share from their experience as well. But we can't continue to produce at this consistency and at the level of quality we aim for without your help. If you would like to join in our mission to support those in Myanmar who are being impacted by the military coup, we welcome your contribution in any form, currency, or transfer method. Your donation will go on to support a wide range of humanitarian and media missions, aiding those local communities who need it most. Donations are directed to such causes as the Civil Disobedience Movement, CDM, families of deceased victims, internally displaced person IDP camps, food for impoverished communities, military defection campaigns, undercover journalists, refugee camps, monasteries and nunneries, education initiatives, the purchasing of protective equipment and medical supplies, COVID relief, and more. We also make sure that our donation fund supports a diverse range of religious and ethnic groups across the country. We invite you to visit our website to learn more about past projects, as well as upcoming needs. You can give a general donation or earmark your contribution to a specific activity or project you would like to support, perhaps even something you heard about in this very episode. All of this humanitarian work is carried out by our nonprofit mission, Better Burma. Any donation you give on our Insight Myanmar website is directed towards this fund. Alternatively, you can also visit the Better Burma website, betterburma.org, and donate directly there. In either case, your donation goes to the same cause, and both websites accept credit card. You can also give via PayPal by going to paypal.me/betterburma. Additionally, we can take donations through Patreon, Venmo, GoFundMe, and Cash App. Simply search Better Burma on each platform and you'll find our account. You can also visit either website for specific links to these respective accounts or email us at info@betterburma.org. That's Better Burma, one word, spelled BETTERBURMA.org. If you would like to give it another way, please contact us. We also invite you to check out our range of handicrafts that are sourced from vulnerable artisan communities across Myanmar, available at alokacrafts.com. Any purchase will not only support these artisan communities, but also our nonprofit's wider mission. That's Aloka Crafts, spelled ALOKACRAFTS, one word, alokacrafts.com. Thank you so much for your kind consideration and support.
Oba yarananda dayananga yaranaya dayanam boda yaranam